the oppressed. You and I are lobbyists for the afflicted.
What does the Lord require? That you do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God.
Welcome to the inaugural podcast of Black Faith, Black Power. I'm Dwayne Royster. I'm the Executive Director of Power Interfaith. I also serve as a Senior Pastor of the Faith United Church of Christ in Washington, D.C., and the founder of an ecumenical religious order called the Society for Faith and Justice. This podcast has come about as a need to have a conversation for the 21st century about the role of Black faith in building Black power to enrich and empower and strengthen the African American community, but not just the African American community, all communities, because we know when the Black community is strong, all communities will be strong at the same time. I'm very excited today because we're going to spend time talking with a colleague, a friend, somebody that has been in this journey with me with Power Interfaith since the very beginning. It was actually at his church, the Mother Bethel AME Church in Philadelphia, that I went to a meeting and met him for the very first time long before Power was actually officially launched as an organization. And so I'm excited to welcome my colleague and friend and radio co-host partner, the Reverend Dr. Mark Kelly Tyler, here with us today to the Black Faith, Black Power podcast. Dr. Tyler, how are you today?
Doing well. Glad to be here. Always looking forward to these kind of conversations. It's what you and I do all the time anyway.
Absolutely. I mean, this is really important to me, especially that you are the first, because I actually had gone to a meeting in North Carolina, and I met Pastor Mike McBride, and I was also there with the Reverend Marlon Milner. We were down in North Carolina doing a symposium about Pentecostalism and social justice. I met Pastor McBride there. We had a conversation. He said, "Hey, you should go check out Power Interfaith," and was talking to me about Wes Lathrop, who was one of the people organizing up here. I got invited to a meeting when I came back up, and I had met Wes a couple times before, and had said, "Hey, this meeting's at Mother Bethel AME Church." And so Marlon and I went over to Mother Bethel, and I met you there for the very first time, not realizing or recognizing what was going to come over the next decade. Right? It's literally been a decade since I met you that very first time. And to see where things would turn out and where it would come today. So thank you for hosting that meeting.
Yeah.
That was
I mean, it was, those were, I kind of stumbled into the relationship with Power probably in a very similar way. It was another clergy person who also directed me. I was on a train, Amtrak. I'd missed my train flying in and out of BWI, which is, if you fly Southwest all the time, it's easier taking Amtrak to BWI than hopping a nonstop flight anywhere in the country. So I would do that a lot and missed my train, a little grumpy about it. The next train comes and I sit in the cafe car and I'm sitting across from a Catholic priest. Additionally, I didn't recognize he was a priest. He just had his black shirt on, but I noticed the white tab kind of open and hanging. And I was like, oh, crap. I mean, we're like literally sitting at the table together in the cafe car. So I'm thinking, I mean, professional courtesy says you got to at least identify yourself, as clergy. And I do. And it was actually Father Kevin Walsh.
Yeah.
We start talking. And so Kevin was like, oh, yeah, we got this thing. Because, of course, we talk about social justice issues. He's like, yeah, we're starting this new group. And you should come to the meeting. So like you, I just kind of stumbled into a meeting. And next thing I knew, we were a part of Power Interfaith as a congregation and hadn't even talked to my people yet. So that's a whole nother story. Hey, by the way, folks, we're part of a new group.
and we should say that Father Kevin Walsh actually was the first board chair of Power. He eventually became the first board chair of Power.
I didn't realize that looking back. Yeah, it's amazing.
Yeah, so that's actually pretty wild. I mean, it's exciting to be a part of this work and to see the transformation that's taken place in Philadelphia throughout the decade that we've been doing this work now. But, I think that there's a particular role for Black faith in this moment, right? We can look at it both historically and also contemporarily. But I mean, the church that you pastor, Mother Bethel, has significance deeply in terms of social justice, civil rights, the movement for Black lives. And I'm not just talking about the movement for Black lives like this moment. I'm talking about for the last several, a couple hundred years. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about, how you see the role of Black faith in building and transforming society for the betterment of not only Black people, but all people. And specifically from your role as the senior pastor of Mother Bethel AME Church.
Yeah, so I don't think that you can have that conversation or even kind of think about going forward if you don't know what's come before, right?
Mm,
And so a lot of people, for example, might wonder, like, why is it always like an Al Sharpton, Reverend Al Sharpton, or a
mm,
Reverend Jesse Jackson, or a Reverend Tracy Blackman, or Reverend Cassandra Gould? Why is it always like some clergy person out there trumpeting the claim, the demands and kind of the hopes and aspirations of Black folk? Why not a Sean King or insert name of activist? Well, there's space for them as well, but historically, the Black church has been kind of the bedrock and the institution that really laid the foundation for understanding that we have to resist this system.
mm,
Before we had, the NAACP, before we had the National Urban League, before we had Black Lives Matter, we had the Black church. And this is not to say that all Black congregations were a part of this movement, but, without question, the AME Church, African Methodist Episcopal Church, has always been in this fight. In fact, I tell people all the time that you may get into trouble. A lot of different things can get you in trouble with your bishop, but in the AME Church, being involved in the fight for social justice and human rights will never get you in trouble. In fact, that you will be supported not only by your congregation, but by your superiors and your colleagues as well, because this is what we do. Our denomination was founded in an act against white supremacy.
mm.
So,
That's right.
Richard Allen was born enslaved in 1760 in Philly, sold as a family to a Delaware planter, and by his early 20s had purchased his own freedom by hauling salt for the Revolutionary Army. So, in fact, his family now are members of the Daughters of the American Revolution, which was a hard fight win to get them into as well. So this young patriot moves back to Philadelphia, becomes a Methodist preacher because he was converted under Methodist preaching, notably by Freeborn Garretson, who was a friend to enslaved Africans. And Richard Allen, is now just like on fire. He comes to Philly, and the Methodist Church had a policy then that anyone who was a good Methodist, to be in good standing, you could not own slaves and you could not participate in it at all to be a member, let alone a clergy person.
Mhm.
Now that's 1784 when they established that. But by 1786, when Allen arrives in Philadelphia, St. George's, things already started to change. And by 1787, they had instituted what they call segregated pews in worship,
Mm.
where Black worshipers were made to sit behind whites, and eventually balconies were created so that they could then be pushed even further away from whites. It wasn't just Philly. It was everywhere there were Methodist churches in the United States, from Charleston all the way up to New York. So Richard Allen and others, Absalom Jones, his partner in ministry, who went on to found the first the first African American led Episcopal church, not
Mhm.
to be confused with AME, but a part of the Episcopal Church movement, Church of England. The two of them got up and led an entire group of people out of St. George's. That act, I mean, think about it. They didn't leave. A lot of times churches are started, new churches split because of some religious difference. We don't
Mhm.
agree on baptism. We don't agree on communion. We don't agree on, I don't know, how long the pastor should be the pastor. But our church was founded as an act against white supremacy that said, we have been enslaved. Absalom
Mhm.
Jones and Allen had been slaves before. They said, we are not going backwards. We're going forward, and walked out to start their independent congregations. That laid the foundation for boycotts against enslaved goods, for writing out and speaking publicly about the end of slavery, using everything within their means, including hosting at Mother Bethel in 1830, the first of the national Black they called them the colored conventions.
Mhm.
And so the first gathering of all of these free Black people from around the country gathered 2 or 3,000 people at Mother Bethel a year before Allen's death to figure out how they were going to move this country forward.
Wow.
So any thought of an AME pastor sitting out a moment like we're living in now, or any moment that we have ever lived in, is just, I mean, it would just be a departure from who we are.
But let me ask you this question though, right? So that's the church. Why are you in the fight? I mean, you invested inordinate, I mean, years. You've invested an inordinate amount of time, energy, and effort into this work. What drives you? What drives you through your faith, your Black faith, to get engaged in this work to build Black power?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I've been asked that question a lot lately. And I mean, I wish I had like some kind of moment where it's like, this lightning struck me in a field. Well, not struck close to a field. It's like, wow, like get involved in this fight. It wasn't really that. But I don't know. I've never liked bullies in my
Mm,
life. And watching a fair share of that growing up. It just, I've always tried to kind of help people who were being pushed aside. As I became, as I grew into my own spiritual awakening, I started to recognize that there was a pattern emerging, especially when I started pastoring. I mean, every church I've gone to, what we have done together, you and I and others, through power, I've done in every place that I've been,
mm,
but not to this degree. So first of all, I've never been in a church this long. I've been here almost 13 years now. Like most Methodists, in your early years, you move a lot early and you move fast. So my first church, 3 years in Jefferson City, Missouri, we founded a group of clergy and I, the first Black preachers conference in the history of the city of Jefferson City, which was
wow,
hard to believe.
wow.
That was 1994. And there's a city where a lot of folks said the civil rights movement kind of missed it. There was
Mm,
a lot of activity in Kansas City and St. Louis on the ends. Our good friend, Reverend Cassandra Gould, is in that area now and can attest that we met a lot of resistance from local people who were like, look, we have a relationship with banks and with other things. We don't need you all rocking the boat. It almost felt like we were having a conversation with Birmingham Blacks from the 1960s who
wow.
told King and others, like, hey, this is Birmingham. We work it out quietly behind closed doors. But when we got there, the treatment of Black students by the school district was atrocious.
Hmm.
There was one high school and it was too big, but they would not break it up because if you look at the history of Jeff City, I can't remember the coach's name for the football team. He was like one of the winningest high school football coaches in the country.
Mm,
The way he did it was to keep the school big. So he got all of the students, Black
right.
and white, and he had a hold on it and the boosters. So his coaches were the coaches for the high school, the middle school, pee wee football.
Mm,
Everyone who coached in the city, he had taught himself. He had a system that just brought you right in from the cradle through his high school program. The result, though, was that Black students were suffering. And so we began to speak out about that, about the treatment by the police. I mean, it was incredible the kind of pushback that we received, even from Black folk. And yet we received a lot of support and affirmation as well.
mhm.
And so that became kind of the template. In a lot of ways, I think if I'd stayed there, we would have probably developed something that looks a lot like what Power is now.
Mhm.
And in every city, though, that I've gone to, whether it's San Francisco or La Jolla or Oxford, Ohio, Camden, New Jersey, whatever, short time or long time, I've always found other colleagues who were like-minded and who wanted to be in similar fights.
So let me ask you, um, what's the relevance right now of and why do Black faith communities need to get engaged in this fight for justice? Why, for throughout the 90s, we weren't really having this conversation. We weren't, the early 2000s. we were in a very different place in faith. We were worried about building big, cathedral congregations and getting on, television and doing all these things. Why should Black faith communities make that transition now? What's special about this moment?
Well, it's funny. So if I go back and look at my sermons from the 90s, and actually I was saying this in the 90s,
Hmm.
in the early 2000s, nobody cared because as you kind of point out, the 90s, it was like the heyday. I mean, all the money from Silicon Valley, money was coming in like hand over fist. It was during the Clinton era. And, again, so in good times, people are not thinking about these kind of things, right? And it's like, oh, who wants to hear, what I mean? Who wants to hear that stuff? We've turned the corner and things are different. But I'd come out of Atlanta for undergrad,
Hmm.
and I'd had some real formative experiences in Atlanta, right? I went to, so we did our spring break in Selma in 1990.
Hmm.
We went down initially for the 25th anniversary of the march to Montgomery.
Hmm.
And when we got there, we discovered that the students had been protesting,
Hmm.
high school students. This was not covered by CNN and the big news trucks. They were all over at the Edmund Pettus Bridge. But as students, we wandered away, got in these conversations. In fact, there was a man who was chained to, they have a Liberty type bell in Selma's courthouse, the county
Hmm.
courthouse. And this guy had chained himself to it to protest the firing of the first Black superintendent of schools,
Wow.
because this man was trying to dismantle the tracking system,
Hmm.
which essentially kept the public schools still segregated.
Hmm.
So everybody went in the same building, but the white kids all went to track 1 and 2, or A and B, which sent you to college. All the Black kids were going to track 3 and 4, or C and D, that was sending them to remedial, and they were graduating. And people were like, why are none of our kids ready for college?
Right.
Superintendent came in, he said, I'll tell you why. And he started to dismantle it. And the board fired him right
Wow.
along racial lines. And so as students, we found this out. We went back to Atlanta, organized, and we came back, students from ITC, the seminary.
Hmm.
I was at Clark, students from Morehouse, Spelman, Morris Brown. We went down like 50 deep. We stayed in the homes of the people who marched with King.
Hmm.
I stayed with Rose Sanders, if I'm not mistaken. Rose Sanders, famous civil rights attorney, her and her husband went on to be elected officials in Alabama. I mean, you talking about an experience. I mean, literally talking to these folks. As a young person, you don't get it. We were in our early 20s in 1990. That wasn't that far removed from the 1960s.
Right.
So these people who were in their 50s were young people with King, supporting King. Some of them had marched across, the Edmund Pettus Bridge on Bloody Sunday. And what they were, I mean, so we were able to see that even though we had the appearance that America had changed, that it hadn't. And so experiences like that really shaped me, that when I started pastoring a few years later, I carried those. And so I've always been, looking out in communities for those places that people are not talking about. Every community
Hmm.
has them. So to your question then about why is this important now? It's always important.
Hmm.
I mean, it has always been important. I mean, if you read the Bible, which grounds my faith, and whether it is in the New Testament with Jesus, who is, while you've got this rich man, Jairus, who everyone wants to cater to, whose daughter is sick, and he's on his way to go heal, this man's daughter. Everyone in the community wants him to do it because, again, he's such an important person. Here is this poor woman who's been sick 12 years, who touches the hem of his garment, gets healed, and then he stops to engage her in conversation,
Hmm.
delaying his visit, and Jairus's daughter dies, right?
Right.
But he still heals her. I mean, it is remarkable because it demonstrates for us, I think, that the church has to have that balance, that it has to care about everybody. Certainly it has to care for those who are like Jairus, who are in a position of privilege, but it also has to care for those people who are absolutely the least of these, who wonder why anybody should stop to give them attention. And I think that it is always right to do what is right. I think King said it in a different kind of way, but he is absolutely right. He was correct that it is never a bad time to do the right thing.
Wow. And I mean, what would be your challenge to African American faith leader colleagues who are saying, I don't want to bring politics into the church. I don't, this is not my thing. Why should they want to get engaged in the work of building collective power to transform society?
Well, I mean, listen, this is America, and we shape everything in the world. I mean, in
Mhm,
fact, if you even look at like, I've been on the continent of Africa a few times, and it's remarkable how sadly sometimes people take the worst of what we do, even in the church,
mhm,
and try to replicate it. Where the church has become a place that is, almost like, I don't know, like, name your high-end department store,
mhm,
right? Where everything is about, show and performance. And, at the end of the day, it's really just about revenue and the personal, benefit to the pastor first, and then the congregation, almost like a corporate board, operates as well in the same interest. And so the questions become, do we get involved in that fight for funding for education? Well, that might hurt our bottom line. Do we get involved in this fight with police? We don't want to alienate this group, right? And so all of a sudden, you start making these decisions about what's best financially versus what is best for people. And
mhm,
I just believe that when you put people first, I mean, Bishop Hildebrand, the late Bishop Hildebrand, who taught us at Payne Seminary, just always said, if you love the people will love you. And he was talking about from a pastoral sense, but I think that extends to this work as well, right? If you put the people first, the people will get you. Don't worry about all the other things. And so to our colleagues who I think can sometimes, and all of us have are guilty of it, I've been guilty of it before as well,
mhm,
get so distracted by that shiny object out there, and wanting to be the next Bishop TD Jakes or whoever, with this mega ministry and like millions of followers and things of that nature, and we almost kill ourselves trying to do that. I mean, look, that's fine for some people. In fact, I have a great appreciation for Bishop Jakes. If you really hear his story and understand who he is, and I've appreciated watching him struggle to grow into responsibility with a tremendous blessing that God has given him,
mhm,
and watching him start to speak out more and wade into issues that, look, we all know 20 years ago he would have never said anything about, right?
mhm,
But watching him struggle, and I got to believe a part of that is from seeing folk like yourself and like our other colleagues who are out here pushing, who have far less, resources, and that there's kind of like well, I got all this, shouldn't I be saying something too?
right.
Look, there is, if we don't do it, who will? Do we want, congregants who are barely able to keep, roofs over their heads? I always say, I say what you can't say, but you want to say.
Mhm,
And I'm free to say it because you pay my salary. And the moment I go too far and I'm off base, then you tell me. But I've never had a member tell me that, except for like when I first started pastoring, who told me, you preach too much of that black stuff. But 3 years later, when
wow.
I left, she was the first one to come and tell me about that she was wrong about that statement.
Mhm, mhm,
But I've never had members come and tell me that we want you to tone that stuff down. But in fact, it's more of a real appreciation that, Rev, thank you for speaking about this or speaking about that, because it has to be said and we have to do something.
mhm. Well, you actually just said something a minute ago. So we do faith-based organizing, right? And so there's a difference between sort of the clergy-based organizing, which is just clergy leaders, and then faith-based organizing, which actually works to empower folk in the pews as well. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you see the difference, because actually I think we need both, right? There's a both, it's a both and not a either or. And I'll give you an example. In the early days of power, and you were aware of this, people were trying to pit power against Black Clergy of Philadelphia. And I was always like, actually, you need both organizations. They serve a little bit different purposes, and you would do that. I know that you've been a part of both organizations. And so I'm wondering if you could just share your perspective on, the difference between clergy organizations and like faith-based organizing movements that we are, what are the benefits of having both and how they can work together.
Yeah, I mean, listen, you have to have both, right? And so a clergy, kind of a clergy group, like I was president for 4 years for the AME clergy in Philadelphia. It's AME Ministers Alliance of Philadelphia and Harrisburg. It used to be called the Preachers Meeting. And so that was a gathering of clergy. And so we talked about different issues that we needed to support. And, I've been a member of Black Clergy, still consider myself a member. I'm not the best member, but I hope that the president forgives me. They know I'm a little busy, but whenever they need me, I'm there with Black Clergy. So there is something about the nimbleness of organizing that way, right?
Mhm.
Because as Black clergy people, when we gather, or Jewish clergy or Muslim clergy, whatever, clergy leaders can, in a moment, make a decision, right? It's
Mhm.
like, look, this just happened. We've got to respond. We don't have time to go back and talk to our people. We need a group to show up, and to show up with 25 to 50 clergy who are there representing themselves is very powerful, especially given the fact that, elected officials know they represent thousands of people
Mhm.
behind them. At the same time, so I would kind of compare a lot of what we do in clergy organizing as a sprint, which is necessary, versus more congregational based organizing, which is more like a long distance run,
Mhm.
which is also important. And that, so on the long distance run, it doesn't happen as fast because, first of all congregations are not the same. Our congregation as an AME is very top down, so if the
Mhm.
pastor says it, folk may not care for it. You may get a little resistance, but you can still do it. And people just decide whether to support it or not. But, my God, we organize with people who have totally different discernment processes, and it's like,
Absolutely.
we need weeks on this question. And it's like,
Mhm.
weeks. We need an answer today. It's like, whoa, whoa, that's not how we do it. And so I've come to really respect the fact that all congregations are not the same. And so therefore, then to just do, I mean, I don't know, like just to get a sign on for what to clergy in a clergy group would seem like this is simple. Yes, we all agree. Well, we have to now wait. And it could take 6 to 8 weeks to get that agreement and buy-in. And by that time, if it's a crisis moment, it's over and done. But long-term organizing then has the ability to really stay on something, like, as I say, like with a dog with a bone, it
Mhm.
won't let it go. And so you need that as well, where there are people who are constantly meeting about school funding. And while it may be a crisis today, it's an ongoing chronic issue. And the ongoing chronic issue then requires long-term maintenance, long-term investment, and to have lay people plugged into it in a way that is clergy. I mean, sometimes we can jump in on this, but then we got to jump out because there's something else that needs our immediate attention.
Mhm.
But I have lay people who this is the only thing they do. They're only concerned about mass incarceration,
Mhm.
or they're only concerned about gun violence or whatever. And they stay in that lane, and it can be a group of 20 or 30 of them. And it's a beautiful thing to watch. I think the issue is that we tend to operate in an either or mindset
Mhm.
instead of a both and.
Okay.
I'm a middle child. So I have 11 year. They are 11 years older, a set of twins, brother and sister, and below me a younger brother. And they
Mhm.
talk about birth order a lot. And birth order experts will tell you that middle children tend to try to bring people together.
Mhm.
you know. And so maybe that's why for me, I tend to try to find the commonality before just trying to find a way to exclude. So I see the absolute value of clergy and lay organizing, and they never have to do the exact same thing, but both of them bring value to how we move our agenda for social justice forward.
You said something that just made me think about this. So talk to me about how you see the role of Black faith in multiracial organizing, right? So the work that Power does is multiracial, and I think a lot of times we are often really inclined to kind of be in this homogeneous groups, like we want to be with this all Black folk, or we want to be with all Jewish folk, or we want to be with all Muslim folk, or we want to be with all white folk, or Latinx folk, or indigenous folk. And multiracial organizing is a little bit more complicated. It you talk about taking time, you got to do some work. Talk to me about why you feel multiracial organizing is important. What happens in that space?
Yeah, so multiracial organizing, first and foremost, is not easy. I mean, it just, I mean, even interdenominational work is not easy among Black folk,
Hmm.
right? I mean, try to get like Methodist and Baptist to work together when our polity is so different. Then you add the layers of race and just the complex issues. I mean, at this moment while we're taping this podcast, there's a tremendous conflict in Israel and Palestine.
That's right.
And so, I have Black activist friends like a Mark Lamont Hill, who is very outspoken about the issue. I've got a lot of Jewish friends who are also equally, like Mark, critical of the Israeli government, but also understand that rhetoric sometimes from an American perspective can like go quickly from a critique of, politics to things that are anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic, right?
Hmm.
And so it's like this, so it can be very difficult in having multi-faith, multiracial, long-term efforts. So what is it that has kept us at the table all these years, over 10
Hmm.
years now, right? You and
Hmm.
I and
That's right.
so many others who have become, I mean, just such dear and close friends, that like literally, we celebrate each other's, the birth of each other's children and grandchildren. We
Hmm.
mourn with each other in the passing of, parents and loved ones. We've been through a lot together. And I would say that while it's not perfect, and I'm sure that we all get on each other's nerves, right? You know what I mean? In certain ways,
No.
and grate on each other, that what has probably kept us together is the ability um, to go through crises together.
Hmm.
There were three moments in the last 5 or 6 years that really, I think, just solidified our relationship, at least within Power and our
Hmm.
clergy. It was the tragic death and killing of, my friend Reverend Clementa Pinckney and
Yeah.
8 members of his congregation, and the way that the community poured out, but more importantly, the way that Power clergy and members poured out. Likewise, the Christchurch killings, New Zealand,
Hmm.
with all of the Muslim persons who were killed there in an attack driven by Islamophobia, that then drew all of us to people like Imam Halim Hassan, and to the Muslim community within Power. And then the Tree of Life killings that happened on a Shabbat during Shabbat services
Hmm.
in Pittsburgh, that then drove all of us to our Jewish siblings. And I got to tell you that when you go through things like that,
Hmm.
and you just really begin to think about the frailty of life, and at the end of the day, what really matters most is that when folk have had your back in a moment like that, and
Hmm.
you've had their back, you're okay with the fact that you're not going to be perfect, and that we're not going to always agree on everything, and that some things are just, I mean, we we're coming from different places, but there is something that brings us together. And in our case, there is the fact that there are a lot of people that just don't like any of us, right? Um, and then our white Protestant allies, right, or
Hmm.
white Catholic allies, who can't necessarily identify with the Jewish experience, the Muslim experience, the Black experience, but they are there. I mean, in every sense, like the abolitionists of the 1800s were,
Hmm.
who acknowledge their white privilege, who acknowledge, white supremacy in all forms, and are trying their best to shred it from their own lives, and are there in solidarity. And it just creates a very important mix. And I think that it is important that that Black people, that we're at those tables.
Mhm.
And I'll tell you the truth, like nobody knows probably within this work, that there have been many times over the early years where I just wanted to just walk away because,
Mhm.
I'm like, I don't have time for this, and but by staying, I was able to see that we all have the ability to grow. We all have the ability to change. And yes, it is frustrating waiting for other people, and doing this kind of work is hard and it's slow at times, but there is tremendous payoff when it happens.
Hmm. I know our time is starting to run out here a little bit, but I do want to ask you this final question, and it'll give you a minute to think about it. But what has been the most transformational moment for you in all that these last 10 years have meant in all this work? What was the moment that you said, "Oh, yeah, this is why we do this. This is how we show up. This is who we need to become." What was that moment for you?
Well, I'll tell you two things. So one is one that really kind of woke me up to the fact that things had changed around organizing, and that the faith community doesn't just automatically have a central role where people just defer to it. You and I we went to Ferguson. When we
Mhm.
came back, we had a group meet at Arch Street United Methodist Church, which is a favorite gathering place for us, Reverend Heineke. So we met there the night that the district attorney in St. Louis County was going to announce whether he was going to charge or not charge Darren Wilson, who had shot and killed Mike Brown,
Mhm.
with a charge him with a crime. We were braced for the fact that he was not going to do it. We didn't think he would, but all around the country, everyone was planning demonstrations in the wake of him not doing it, should that happen.
Mhm.
So we were coordinating, you remember, with Patrice Armstead, who was working for Power at the time. And she was outside across the street at City Hall on the apron with a number of community activists and organizers, a lot of young people that were kind of starting to be in relationship with. And the plan was we would be inside the church. They wanted to be outside. We invited them in, but they chose to be outside. Fine. And once the announcement was made, we did our little thing. We had some speeches. You said something. We led a prayer. It was very orderly, very, much like faith leaders do. And we marched our merry band of clergy and lay outside of Arch Street, ready to go and lead the people through the city of Philadelphia in this protest. You get there and nobody is there. Like nobody. It's a couple of cops hanging around. And we walk all around City Hall. We're like, did we miss something? And so we call Patrice and I'm like, Patrice, this is Reverend Tyler. Where are you all? She said, we already took off. And I'm like, Patrice, what are you talking about? You left. With the deal was you're supposed to wait for us. And so just tell them to wait. We have to catch up. We have a lot of older people. We can't walk that fast. And she says, Reverend Tyler can't stop. I'm like, Patrice, you have to stop because we have to catch up with you. She said, Reverend Tyler, the movement has already left. Either catch up or we'll see you later. I looked at the phone. Like, what? And so we caught up.
I remember that night very well.
Yeah, they luckily for us, they made a U-turn at the roundhouse at the police headquarters and started coming back down Arch Street. And so we just cut them off at the pass and we jumped on in and fell in. But it was such an awakening. I use that story a lot when I'm talking about, when people ask me the question about what's different about organizing today versus what we've seen historically. And it is that the church does not automatically get a privileged center seat anymore. And I mean, and I should say faith community. So the church, the synagogue, the masjid, people don't automatically defer to us in the same way that they would have done to Malcolm or to Rabbi Heschel or to Martin, right?
Mhm.
They just automatically, people deferred to them. You have to earn that spot now. And I think that, through a lot of our organizing, even some of the younger folk who may not still totally, get what we do, may not have the patience for it. That's also part of youth, but they respect the fact that we're committed to this. And nobody's going to tell us that we're not committed, because we have not been a flash in the pan in any of this work, whether
Right.
it's been the fight around wages at the airport, whether it's been the fight around funding for public schools, or this current fight around police reform, that when we get into it, we're going to stay there. And so, you asked about the transformational moment. The other one was, I guess, really like yesterday when we were Power Live Free participated in a public hearing on the new police oversight commission that's about to be passed. We know it's going to pass. It's going to go from basically a toothless police oversight commission that was nothing more than window dressing to something that really begins to have the power and ability to weigh in, to investigate, to make recommendations on discipline. You're going to go from a budget of $500,000 to certainly over $13 million. I mean, that's just that alone. And so, I was on the call yesterday, and I think about all the meetings that that Live Free, Power Live Free has had. Just countless meetings. And Councilmember Jones was right. He said, "I don't think most of y'all get paid, do you?" And I was like, "Nah." I said, "A couple of us do now. I mean, but even before, I spent years before becoming a co-director on staff. But I'm thinking of like all these volunteers, Gail Lax and Amy Mann and Michael Clemens, and just folk who, and Bo Sullivan and others who just, I mean, man, it's just hours on the phone, looking at legislation, offering recommendations, talking to other cities. And I'm sitting there yesterday, literally, I'm trying not to get emotional now, like just thinking, like, we're about to move money from the budget that people told us a year ago would never happen.
Right.
Like they said it would never happen. Like when we looked at the 500,000 and said that's ridiculous. They thought it was that when they doubled it to 900,000 to $1 million, the city thought they were doing something that we should be happy about. And so to push, you know what I mean? Like, and again, and I framed my remarks yesterday that, I mean, yes, it's been our organizing to give the frame, but also recognize that we wouldn't be in this moment had George Floyd not died.
Wow.
Had Walter Wallace not died. Had Breonna Taylor not died. So it has cost us much for this victory. But, we don't want their deaths to be in vain. And so that's what organizing is about, is that so don't let them die in vain. Their sacrifice should be honored by real change. And the fact that people like the FOP are fighting like hell against this tells us we're on the right track, and that this is not just simply a pipe dream or something that will be more window dressing. We're going to have to fight to keep it accountable. We're going to have to fight to keep it honest. But to know that organizing can lead to that kind of change, I'm going to tell you, I mean, like I said, yesterday, it was mind blowing to me knowing that we had a part in that, and that is the fruit of what real organizing can do.
So, at the end of most, shows that I've watched on Christian television, they always ask the person that they're interviewing to extend an invitation for the people at that particular moment. And so if you were to be an evangelist for folk to coming into organizing, what would be the invitation that you would share to them?
Well, first of all, I won't tell you to, put your hand on the TV and your other hand in your pocket and send $1,000 to me. No, I won't do that. That's usually how those invitations. Oh, and by the way, get Jesus. Like, no, we don't. That's not our mode. But I would say, that this table is open to all. So to congregants who hear this, and your congregation may not be a part of it, share it with your pastor, share it with your imam, share it with your rabbi, whoever your faith leader is, or maybe your congregation that doesn't have an identifiable faith leader, like Quaker meeting. So take it and you all just, hear it together and try to discern, is this something for us? Because, again, I think what makes this work most fruitful is when the entire body gets it, right? May is the month for pastoral appreciation. And so I was very fortunate this year. My members of my steward board, the officers that set the pastor's salary and kind of take care of the pastor, they wanted to do each Sunday a video to be inserted in the virtual worship service, like, asking people to be a blessing to me and to my wife and family, which was it was really nice of them to do that. They didn't have to. But what got me was Dr. Edwin Ferguson. He starts rattling off all of the things that are central tenets of Power's work, right? He says, and Rev is always extolling to us that we've got to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour. We need to like address the fair funding formula in Harrisburg. We need to, and I'm like, wow. I mean, the fact that here's a layperson who is like, I mean, you don't need me, right? I mean, that's the goal of organizing. And, as a clergy person, that you want your members to own it like you own it, where they internalize it, where they own it. So I say to clergy who are listening that this is also an opportunity to activate your congregation. And I'm going to tell you, our congregation has also grown as a result of this. And it's grown, I think, in a very healthy way with people who have come to us who have said repeatedly over the years that, I saw Mother Bethel as a part of this movement, and I wanted to be in a congregation that's about something else other than just, church with being business as usual. So we invite you. The table is open. You'll find people who are waiting and excited about you joining in. And if there's a fight that we're not involved in yet, we start out with one campaign, and that was at the airport. And that was a big fight to even get the one campaign.
Right.
But somebody's always brought something else to us, and then something else comes. And so who knows, now we're in climate justice as well. Maybe you are the answer that we're looking for. And so don't sit on the sidelines. And one last thing, if you feel like a misfit, then this is probably good work for you, because most of us say we don't really fit in elsewhere. So come on, this is the island of misfit toys. You're welcome here.
Reverend Dr. Mark Kelly Tyler, Senior Pastor of Mother Bethel AME Church, Co-Director of Power Live Free. Thank you so much for doing this interview with us today and being a part of this inaugural podcast of Black Faith, Black Power, sponsored by Power Interfaith. We deeply appreciate you, brother, your labor, your work, everything that you do, and your leadership. And we are glad to follow you and partner with you to help change the damn world. So blessings, Dr. Tyler, and thank you so much for being here with us on this episode.
Hey, you're welcome. Do I get to keep the t-shirt?
You get to keep the t-shirt. That's right. Take care.
Thank you for listening to Black Faith, Black Power, produced by Power Interfaith.